start right on time, and I'm going to be as quick as I can because you didn't come to hear me speak. I'm Nancy Handrigan. I'm Vice President, External Relations, and we're thrilled to see you all here, overflowing. There are a few seats if you can come down, or pull chairs in from the lobby if you need to. But we've got about 45, 50 minutes perhaps, so you won't be standing for too long. So I've got notes so I don't get off track. Of course, we are pleased to present this special event this evening here at Acadia in Wolfville, in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And I already introduced myself. I want to welcome students, lots of students, faculty, staff. I see tons of community members and alumni. Obviously, you're very interested in our speaker and the topic this evening. A special welcome to Chancellor Nancy McCain. Don't know where you are. There you are. And President Jeff Hennessy and other members of our senior administration at the university. And we also have Julie Van Exen here, our MLA, thank you. And if I missed anyone, Mayor John Kay or Cody Boyce or anybody from government, welcome. You can raise your hand or we'll certainly see you after. But thank you all for being here. So we are very fortunate, of course, to have about, as I said, 45 or 50 minutes to hear from the Honorable Bill Morneau in conversation with our own Dr. Alex Marland, Jarislowsky Chair in Trust and Political Leadership. I'm going to briefly introduce our esteemed guest. You will easily find his biography, of course, on the internet, but I will just outline a few highlights. The Honourable Bill Morneau was Canada's 39th Minister of Finance from 2015 to 2020. And I will say we were lucky to have Bill here a couple of years ago in this very room, so some of you were probably here that evening. Bill was also governor at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank at that time. And so this is a long bio that has many roles in in business as well as volunteer leadership roles. He's an avid volunteer with several organizations. He's an academic in his own right through Yale University and University of Toronto and a couple of the professional schools there. He's the founder of the school, he's a writer, and I know you want to hear from him. So I'm going to pass it over to Alex and Bill for Q&A. There you go.
Great. All right, first of all, thank you everybody for coming. This is fantastic turnout. It's great to see so many members of the broader community, students and colleagues from Acadia University, faculty members and others. There's a lot going on in Canadian politics, and Bill Morneau has all the answers for us. And so just to set the stage, what we're planning on doing is we're just going to talk about how we got to where we are. And then I've asked him if I can kind of deal with the elephant in the room. So I'm hoping that he'll end up kind of helping us understand what has been going on in the last month or so based on his experience. So just to start things off, I'll just set the scene just to remind everybody how we got to where we are today in Canadian politics. So this is just top of the mind. I'm going to miss some things, but basically 2015, Stephen Harper, evil. Justin Trudeau, good, comes in, all sorts of changes start occurring. All of a sudden, we're all allowed to smoke pot legally. We're allowed to be killed in medical assisted dying legally. Things change, policy, all sorts of adjustments. Justin Trudeau goes to India. Then, 2019, big SNC-Lavalin controversy. There ends up being a whole bunch of other things that end up happening, but along the way, there ends up being some conflict starting to emerge between the finance minister and the prime minister's office. And I won't get into all of that. 2020, March 2020, pandemic. All of a sudden, there's all sorts of pressures on government to spend. There's going to be conflict inherently, almost no matter who would have been finance minister and prime minister at that time, over what to do in such a crisis. Time goes on. Mr. Morneau ends up leaving in government. We end up having an election in 2021 simply because Justin Trudeau, frankly, wanted to get a majority government. That didn't end up happening. And basically, after 2021, a number of things ended up happening. I skipped the 2019 election. What ended up happening is there ends up being a supply and confidence agreement with the NDP, and the Liberals end up moving more towards the political left. And then slowly what we start seeing is the Conservative Party starts rising in public opinion polls and the Liberals start going down. And then everything sort of starts spiraling out of control. And then what ends up happening is the Liberals lose some key by-elections, particularly in Toronto, where they should never have lost that. And eventually we end up seeing a big explosive announcement happen in December from Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland. Now, there's other context that has happened around the world, and Mr. Morneau is going to give us that context.
Well, that's a big introduction. Well, let me start by saying how nice it is to be back at Acadia University. I know from some of the gray hair in the room that not everyone is an undergraduate here, so I'm delighted to see there's people from the community as well as students here tonight. So for me, it's really great to have the opportunity to rekindle some relationships and talk about what I think is going on, and hopefully having some interaction and hearing what you're thinking about. But I said to Alex that I thought a way to frame our discussion today, before we get into the who's doing what to who and why and what might happen, is to think about the broad themes going on in our world. And I think that's a good way to start. And we talked a little bit, I was in Andrew, one of our economic professors at Acadia, in his class earlier today, and we talked a little bit about what's going on around the world. And the way I always like to start is for us to remember that Canada is a great place, and things are broadly going as well as we could have possibly hoped post-pandemic. If we think back to not that many years ago, we were facing an extreme challenge, one the likes that we hadn't seen for 100 years. And we had probably everybody here in this room at home. We had people not at work. We had people that were worried about paying for their rent or their groceries. And we had some real challenges coming out of that. We had big inflation. We had concerns about what might happen as a result of that. But the good news is we are recovering. And I think it's always important to start with the good news, because we sure spend a lot of time talking about the bad news. So that said, now I'm going to talk about some of the other things. The things that I worry about most, and I'll put these in the really broad big picture. The first thing I worry about most globally is the amount of debt we're accumulating around the world. So I want to put it in context. The global economy is about $110 trillion. And global debt last year passed $100 trillion. And we're accumulating more debt at a rapid pace. So the United States, which is about 25% of the global economy, has a deficit that's about 6.5%. So each year, they're adding about 6.5% of that $26 trillion to their debt and to the global debt. Similar sorts of numbers in France, similar sorts of numbers in England. The point is, we are putting on the next generation some really significant obligations with that debt. So that is a big issue, and I say it's a big issue because it's not sustainable. We can't expect that will be able to go on forever in the same way. And that means that eventually we will either have to cut back on social programs in some of those countries, or have inflation that's higher than we would otherwise want in order to inflate away those debts, or in the best case scenario, grow the economy faster than would otherwise have been possible. And that last thing is unfortunately really hard. And if none of those things happen, then we end up in crises territory. So I do worry about that. Our political systems do not seem well geared to deal with these challenges. But after I think about that, I think about the big challenges facing us globally as well as facing us in Canada. And I'd identify 3 challenges, and if we get to talk about these a little bit more, it would be great. The first one I identify is demographics. And so much of our world, so much of our economy, so much of the issues in politics are driven by demographic trends. And what's going on? We're getting older. So around the world this is happening, but it's also happening in Canada. In the last decade, live births in China have gone down by 50%. That's how significant a change has happened. So there's been a huge deceleration going on there. Around the world, the replacement rate, if we're going to keep the size of our population the same, we need to have 2.1 children per couple. And there's no developed country that is meeting 2.1 children per couple with the exception of Israel. What we're doing in Canada is about 1.33 children per couple. And why does that matter? Our systems are built on a population that looks like this. More people young supporting fewer people that are older. And when all of a sudden it becomes like this, you've got people supporting a similar cohort at the top, it becomes very deeply challenging because you have the potential for strife between generations. If the less old population is supporting a population that's costing them more and more, you can see how strife happens. So issue number one that I worry about. Issue number two that I worry about, that I'm sure others here are concerned with, is climate. We're not spending around the world enough to move our energy transition fast enough to reduce the emissions to get to where we want to get to. You will have probably seen in your news feed that last year was the first year we were ahead of 1.5 degrees on top of where we've been over time in our climate transition, and that's frankly not a good place to be. And what that means is if we want to get to the place we want to get to by 2050, there's fewer and fewer years to get there, and we're not spending as much. But I will tell you the cost to get there doesn't change just because there's fewer years. So we are banking on being able to get to things in the future that are not easy to get to. Final issue I worry about a lot is geopolitics. We're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, but really, as I think about the world, we are breaking into two blocks. There are not very many things that Americans agree on, but one thing the Democrats and Republicans, the Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration agree on is that they don't want China to be the largest or most important country on the planet. And so that means there's a competition going on that is very different than was the case when I was coming into office in 2015. At that moment, we were looking at the possibility of working with China. We were looking at how successful China was in alleviating child poverty over the 20 years before, and feeling like the possibility for trade was increasing. Well, the world doesn't look like that anymore, and increasingly this geopolitical fight is a challenge. It's making things more expensive because we're developing two supply chains in the world, and it means that we're going to spend more on defense. We're inevitably going to spend more on defense in our country, in other developed countries, but around the world. And that is important, but clearly is not something that adds immediate economic value to those of us in our day-to-day lives. And I will tell you that defense itself is getting more and more challenging. With the advent of technology, all of a sudden drones can be on the offense, so defense gets much more expensive in defense. Cyber is much easier to do with AI, so it means that defending against that gets more and more expensive. So it's an increasingly challenging world that we're facing. So I lay all that out as the sort of the global environment, and then I come to the Canadian situation, and we're facing issues that are related to what's going on globally. And the way I would put it to you, just to put it in really easy terms, is I think about the economy in terms of the income statement and the balance sheet. What do I mean by that? I think about it as prices and housing. So let me just tell you where I see the challenge, and this leads into our political discussion. Inflation has been really challenging for people over the last few years. As I said at the outset, it's coming down, but people don't think about inflation, they think about prices. They worry about the cost of things. And over the last 5 years, the cost of food and gas in Canada has gone up by 27%. And over those same last 5 years, the average wage has gone up by 16%. So you can see the challenge on the price side, on the income statement side. So for people that are living and spending most of the money that they bring in each month, they see an 11% difference from where they were not that many years ago. So people are rightfully anxious. That's the income statement side. The balance sheet side, if anything, is even more problematic when you think about that demographic problem I was talking about. On the balance sheet side, people are looking at the cost of housing and saying, it just doesn't look like the generation that's coming up today will have the opportunity to do what the generation was able to do just not so many years ago. So if you look at the cost of housing versus incomes, 20 years ago, average house cost in Canada was about 5.8 times the median wage. And today, it's about 10.8 times the median wage. So it means the possibility of getting a house is fundamentally more challenging. And that's broadly the case around assets in general. People who were lucky enough to be around my age lived through 20 years of very low interest rates. When interest rates are low, asset prices go up. So they gained more assets. And it doesn't look like that's going to be the likely outcome for the next generation. So there is a very real frustration with that. That's what's animating the upcoming election in Canada, as well as, unfortunately, another particular problem which we need to get a handle on, and that is the issue around immigration. One of the great things we had in Canada for so long is a consensus, cross-party, that immigration was positive for our country. Because we'd seen waves of immigrants come over many, many years and add to the value of our country, add to the GDP of our economy, add to the cultural advantage we have as a country. But over the last few years, we got it wrong. And that getting it wrong has caused real angst across the country. So what happened? We radically increased the number of temporary foreign workers. We radically increased the number of international students. We went from, in 2021, 1.3 million people that were here that were temporary, to, in 2024, 3 million people that were temporary. 7% of the population, without thinking about the impacts on housing, housing costs, because obviously as you add more people, everything gets impacted, or on things in big cities like traffic or healthcare access, things that people see on a day-to-day basis. So there is a fraying of that consensus that immigration is a good thing. Now, I'm an optimist. I think we're going to get back to thinking that this is a positive thing, because if you remember my demographic worry, that our demographic thing that used to be a triangle looks a little bit more like a rectangle. We need to try and use immigration to help to impact that. So I think we'll get there, but it's a particular moment of challenge. So I lay all this out because that's the fraught grounds for not only Canada, the upcoming election, you've got people that are rightfully anxious and concerned. And more broadly, that sort of broader geopolitical issue that's facing the Trump administration. And these same dynamics are going on in the United States. So as we see Donald Trump do things that don't look entirely rational to us, we need to remember that he's facing some challenges that are not so different than we are, and doing things that, while they might not look rational to us, generally have a purpose. Some of that we can discern right now, some of it we'll see pretty soon. But the point is, it's going to be a time of real change and real challenge. And so from those people that really like to watch politics, it will be an exciting time. For those of us who care about the economy, it's a worrying time. And I'm in both categories, so it'll be exciting and worrying. So with that, I'm happy to be here and happy to have a dialogue with everyone.
Okay, all right. So we're going to see if we can have time for some questions after. I just want to tee things up, though, by maybe just talking about what has been happening in Canadian politics, because I think a lot of us in this room are still trying to understand everything that has happened, and you'll have a perspective that we don't. So, really three major things have happened in Canadian politics in the last month or so. December 16, Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, Trudeau loyalist for so many years, abruptly, at least abruptly to us, posts a letter saying that she's leaving cabinet, resigning her positions, and takes some shots at the Prime Minister at the same time. So that was event number one. That sets in motion a number of things that led to a number of Liberal MPs and others saying that it was time for the Prime Minister to go. He goes on a vacation over Christmas, comes back, I think it was January 6th. And
a long vacation.
Skiing, It wasn't the first time he's taken a vacation, of course. But then ends up happening, he comes back and he says, I have contacted the Governor General, who has agreed to prorogue Parliament, so Parliament is not going to sit until I believe it's March 27th. And as well, I will be tendering my resignation as leader of the Liberal Party, and then ultimately as Prime Minister once a new leader has been chosen. So that was event number two. And then, of course, event number three is still in motion, which is the Liberal Party of Canada is actively now figuring out a way to replace Justin Trudeau as leader. They've changed some of their rules about who it is that can apply, $350,000 if anybody has it. is available to run. And so there's a number of people who are dropping out. There's some people who are announcing, and we're going to see a leadership campaign emerging over the next little while. So those three things have happened, and all of us in this room are trying to wrap our head around what's going on. And so what are your thoughts about them?
So that's a lot.
Yeah.
So maybe we can start with, the Liberal government over the course of the post-pandemic era has, faced some significant challenges. And fundamentally coming out of COVID, what happened was inflation was the biggest challenge. And so it means that, it means that obviously people are feeling more anxious. So they've been trying to figure out what to do to deal with that anxiety. And the places they've gone, the ways that they've approached that, have not been ways that have resonated with Canadians. I think that the level of frustration has not been met with policy that has really addressed the core concerns. And to be fair to the government, it is awfully hard to deal with some of these issues. I mean, housing is a long-term structural issue that you need to try and deal with. The government doesn't have an ability to make prices go lower. So it's not easy. There's not an easy set of policy solutions. And Canada is not unique. Other countries are facing similar sorts of challenges. But I'm not saying that there's been a good job done, because I think there have been some very important policy mistakes. The number one of which I would put in place is the immigration situation, which I've already talked about. So what's happened is this increasing sense of concern within Canadians, as well as within the Liberal Party, that things are not going as well as they could. So if you're a member of Parliament in Ottawa, and you're a Liberal member of Parliament, and you see your constituents very frustrated and less likely to vote for you next go round, you're getting anxious. And that is what's going on in Parliament. So there's an increasing level of concern. That pressure has been building up on the Prime Minister for the last year and a half. And he has, in my estimation, been very, very slow to respond to that. So that sense of slow reaction has been, building up. And really what you saw with the Minister of Finance in December is the culmination of that frustration over a period of time. Now, you also saw some bad behavior on the behalf of the Prime Minister's office last August. So if you remember, and I don't encourage people to remember this, back when I left government, there was a lot of noise that came from the Prime Minister's office saying that we were having fights, and they were putting it in the newspapers. The point is, rather than addressing things directly, the pattern was to do it in the newspapers. And that was what was happening to Minister Freeland last August. So there was already a level of frustration that the Prime Minister's office didn't really want her to be Finance Minister anymore. So that was the situation that led up to this difficult moment in December, where the Prime Minister's office was saying, well, we'd like you to have another job. And clearly you saw her response, which was, that isn't really something I want to do. So that's the build up to that. And in terms of the next steps, what you're seeing going on now is a recognition by the potential candidates to run for the Liberal Party leadership that the probability of the Liberals winning in the next election is quite low. So I'm not going to ask everyone's proclivity in this room, but what I can tell you is that among the people that were my supporters in 2015 and 2019, that voted for me because they believed in the party, they believed in our goals and our platform, or they believed in me, those people are less likely to vote Liberal in 2025 than they were back in those previous periods. So as you look at Francois-Philippe Champagne, who announced yesterday, or Anita Anand, or Melanie Joly, the reason they're not running is because, frankly, they see this as unlikely to be a winnable opportunity. And so the idea that they would run to be leader and then to find themselves in an immediate election campaign with a party that is much more in favor, that's not a very appealing situation. So you're left with, I think, there might be a number of candidates that are not really very well known, but two reasonably well-known candidates, and two, I would say, experienced and capable people with their strengths and weaknesses in Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney, and they both have, different reasons to argue why they'd be strong leaders of the Liberal Party and prospectively strong prime ministers. But I think the real fight comes after that. I think this is a precursor to an election, and in that election, I think it is very, very hard for an incumbent government to deal with what I identified earlier, that 11% gap between gas prices and food prices and wage increases, and that 5.8 to 10.8 times income for a house. Those are fundamental issues that we need to get a handle on, and I believe Canadians don't think that the current government has met up to their expectations. So, in my estimation, it's going to be a very challenging election for the Liberal Party.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just open it up to a few questions. Now, I know everybody in this room is thinking, why on earth is Bill Morneau not putting his name forward to be Liberal leader? Right? Because we need people like this in politics. But that question aside, does anybody have a question? I think I saw a hand over here, yeah? Okay, go ahead, ma'am. Yeah.
Just so you, sorry, I forgot your name.
My name is Bill.
Okay, I call you sir. You mentioned rectangle versus triangle, so I don't really, can you elaborate on that? Remember you mentioned.
Sure, yeah,
The second thing is, you say, the medium wage, you're talking about, I don't remember, but I don't know what is the medium wage here across.
Yeah.
Canada or.
Right.
And then, I find it strange, how come the party leader is also a prime minister? Because it should be, separate things.
Right.
And the last thing is, why people can't, they spend 8 years, right, together, right? So the first part was okay, right? That means they kind of can work together. Then the second half, why can't they just sit down, have a nice meal?
Okay, that's a lot of stuff. So you're testing my prowess at remembering, but I'm going to try and go through your 4 questions. So let me just identify them one by one. What I'm identifying as the demographic challenge. Most of our systems, our healthcare systems, our employment insurance systems, our old age security systems, our guaranteed income supplement, they were all built in the post-World War II time period. And if you remember what was happening in the post-World War II time period, people came back from war and they had a lot of babies. And so what you had in that baby boom was you had, young people were more plentiful than older people. And at the top, your life expectancy was not nearly as long then as it is now. So not that many years ago, life expectancy was very different than it is today. So you actually had many more young people than older people. So if you're building a system that's going to pay older people when they're in the hospital or their Social Security, then you want to have a lot of people to fund that, right? So now all of a sudden, you don't have as many babies, so there's not as many people. And the older people, happily are not dying as rapidly, so they're staying around. So the cohorts, it looks more like this, and then people die. So that is what's going on. Our social systems weren't built for that. So you don't have as many people paying in to help you out. So that is a challenge, which means we're going to have just more sort of debt per person in the country than we expected. Number one. Median income in Canada. So median income in Canada right now is around $64,500. And over the last generation, that has been pretty stagnant for people, especially people that are, in their 20s and their 30s. So that's the reality. It's gone from around 35,000 to around 65,000 or so over that 20-year period, and that's a very real issue. So, if you then get to your other questions, and I think the most important one really is, I'll get to the Liberal leader one before. It's a parliamentary system. So the way a parliamentary system works is parties are, created. They elect the leader of the party, and the parties compete in a parliamentary democracy. And the leader of the party that gathers the most seats and the confidence of the House becomes the Prime Minister. So that's just the way our parliamentary system works. And to the final question around why can't everybody get along, it's just the reality is the pressures of time make governments harder and harder to manage. The reality is that the issues that you came into government to serve, so I came into government with the idea that we were going to focus on how we could help those people that were struggling to get by and hopefully grow the overall size of the economy. And we were really successful in the first part. In the second part, I would say because we tried to do too many things at once, we weren't as successful there. So as you find successes and failures, tempers get higher and challenges get greater, and it's the natural lifespan of a government. If you look back at history in Canadian governments, you know, there's a reason that after a period of time, people say it's time for a change. They get tired with governments. They see that new thinking is required, and it's a healthy part of a robust democracy. So I don't think we should necessarily be worried about that. That fight for people's votes hopefully creates better ideas and a commitment to solving problems that are continuing to stay around that we're worried about.
But is that such a natural phenomenon, like in the past government?
It's very common.
I'll come here in a second. I just want to make sure that I'm just going to go back to Sterling because I want to make sure we get student voices out in here, okay?
Hi, I'm Sterling. I apologize in advance. I'm going to put you in the hot seat a little bit and ask about the carbon tax.
Sure.
The way I see it, there's a couple of possible ways that the Liberal Party kind of went wrong with that and why it's so unpopular. It could be that it's communicated poorly. Some people think it's not very timely. And a lot of people think it's just a bad policy. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, because I think you'd be a very good person to ask about this, where do you think that went wrong?
So if you think that's a hot seat, that's nothing. So just to be clear, I was the one who put forward the carbon price. So that was me, and so I take responsibility for the success, and I take responsibility for the problems. It wasn't me alone, so I don't own full responsibility, but it was a piece of legislation that I put forward. We came into office saying, look, we think that a market-based approach to dealing with carbon emissions is the smart way to go at this. That if we put a price on carbon, that will encourage people to make choices, it will encourage businesses to make investments that will reduce their carbon intensity. I still believe that is the right policy. So I would argue that carbon pricing is the right policy. Now that said, I think there were plenty of mistakes, and I think you're right to point them out. I think that, you know, we have a challenge in our country that we have, 10 provinces and 3 territories, and, there's a question of whether should we really have allowed for different application of the policy in different provinces, or should we have waited and found a way for everyone to do the same thing. So Quebec's cap and trade system and what at a certain time was Ontario's cap and trade system was different than BC's carbon price. And so as you have a different set of policies, it's kind of hard to communicate to people. The carbon rebate program, which by the way means most people in this room are not actually paying anything for carbon pricing, just to point out the truth of the matter, irrespective of what you see in ads. That pricing is hard to understand and it's inconsistent across the country, and we didn't do the rebates in a way that was making that easier. And that's partially because administrative stuff is hard and we just couldn't get it right. So yeah, there were some mistakes. Where I think it will go, and I hope it will go, is that we'll continue to have carbon pricing on heavy emitters, on industry. And I think that both parties will adopt that. Where I think it needs to continue to go is to not consider caps on emissions. What the Liberal Party did after I was there was they sort of doubled down. We said we're going to do carbon pricing, but then the way I was describing it to the group earlier is, I'm wearing a belt. I'm not wearing a belt and suspenders. So, I think the idea, you do one policy, but you don't do both. So you don't do carbon pricing and put emissions cap, because it's like you're making it almost impossible for the resource sector to feel like they have a fair set of arrangements. So, you can increase the carbon price, but putting emissions cap is telling them that their investments have a short time life, so they're just not going to make them. So look, there's reasons that it was the right policy then. There's implementation challenges that are hard, and we're not the first country to have this problem, right? Australia put in place carbon pricing. The next government that came in took away carbon pricing, and the next government after that's putting carbon pricing back in. So it is hard to do this. I mean, the whole issue around any sort of program that forces people to pay for stuff is they have to pay for stuff, and nobody likes that. So it sometimes takes some time to get those policies across. But I would just say if we decide not to do this, that we will face other costs. We will face much higher costs in terms of adaptation. I mean, we see what's going on in California. I would say that we will end up needing to have significant policy expenditures to make sure that people are not living in places where there are wildfires, that people are not living in places where we're subject to droughts or floods. Those are very real issues. So we're going to end up spending that money too. It's likely inevitable, and I would say that we need to do those two things at the same time, but probably do it in a way that's more measured, and that's hard in politics. So I think instead what we'll have a flashback, and then we'll push forward, and that's the way we'll probably get there.
Oh, hi. Well, if the last person didn't put you on the hot seat, then I will. So anyways, it's about the carbon, right? So, and I have an honest question. I'm trying to understand, right? So we are coming out of an ice age, right? So there used to be like a 2-kilometer thick ice cover here, and it melted without CVs, without SUVs and all that. So to me, I mean, that shows that there's a natural climate change that's happening towards the warming, right? Because we're coming out of an ice age. So that's the other thing. Like I try to wrap my head around. And then the other thing is, so right now, well, we know that carbon dioxide is a life-giving gas, right? Without which no life will exist on Earth because it's plant food. So right now we have like 410 or 420 parts per million in the atmosphere, right? And it has gone up, a little bit, like it was 280, and now it's 410 over the last 100, 200 years. And the Earth is greening because it's food, it's plant food, right? And you can go to the NASA website and that's what they say. Like the Sahara Desert is actually getting smaller because there's more greenage now. So that's just something I'm trying to, understand. And then the other thing is that, so we put a carbon, we say, okay, we have to, right now there are 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide particles in the air, which is really like a trace gas, right? Like it's like one of the least. But how low do we have to go in order to stop the climate change? Like how many parts per million? So can I so during the Jurassic era, right, where like vegetation was so big and the leaves were as big as cars, they had 6,000 parts per million,
So
right?
maybe I can. So
and then I want to ask something about the prorogation. I know. Sorry, guys.
Yeah. So the challenge we face is not really a debate anymore about whether the climate is warming. I mean, people, and I think you rightly point out that is happening. I don't think we really need to spend a huge amount of time debating the science. I think what we do need to recognize, though, is that there are ways that we can mitigate the rate of increase. So irrespective of your political persuasion, you'll know that it's a bad thing if we find ourselves with millions of people who are displaced because of climate. So right now the estimates are that over the course of the next 15 years, 216 million people in countries will be displaced because of climate events. So that's the best estimate of what's going to happen. So that's what we think is going to happen. And so that means 216 million people that are going to be moved from where they live to somewhere else because of climate. So what I'm just arguing is that responsible public policy needs to appreciate that and think about, are there ways we can mitigate that? And the reality is that Canada alone, we can't do it. So I'm not arguing that we have an unequal share of the burden because of our wealth. I'm not arguing any of that. I'm just saying that this is a challenge that we face around the world, and we're not meeting up to the challenge as rapidly as people hoped. So I'm not actually even putting any political spin on it. I'm just saying that if the expectation is it's going to cost X to do this in 15 years, and we don't do anything for 5 years, and now we have 10 years, it still costs X. And what I'm worried about is the economic impact, because that X that we have to spend in that shorter time period means we don't have as much to spend on, food and diapers and, houses or whatever else we want to spend on. That's just a reality. So it's going to cost us a lot. And I will just say, as someone who is a recovering politician, it is very hard to get people to think about the long term. So my job now as someone who doesn't have to, think about getting elected tomorrow is to say, this is a problem. We got a problem that we have a lot of money we're going to want to spend on a bunch of things, not just this, and we need to think about how we're going to deal with it now. That's all.
So what is the
Well, we should-
number of CO2 in the no.
Yeah, but we should.
What
We
is the
should.
perfect number of CO2 particles in the atmosphere
I don't.
to stop it?
I don't know the answer to that, but I'm
Well,
sure
how
that
far do we go then?
the trajectory is the challenge, and I'm sure we can have a nice discussion afterwards if you want.
Okay, we're going to go to the back over here. Yeah.
This is about political rhetoric. I know that the role of the leader of the opposition in the parliamentary system is to criticize the government and possibly present alternate ways to do things. It seems to me that in the last 10 years, it's become sound bites, especially the current leader of the opposition. In the U.S., we all know what's happening. Somebody whose mouth and brain aren't connected, that was going to be president. I mean, what can we do to make political rhetoric, I don't want to say more gentlemanly, but that's not what I mean, but
Yeah, I think
Pearson and Diefenbaker didn't get along at all, yet they treated each other with some respect when they were debating in the House of Commons. Are we ever going to get back to that?
I think every era faces its own challenges based on the time and place. I think that the change in the way that we get information is very fundamental to this. And so the advent of social media means there's no filter anymore. So the ability for anyone in this room to send out your point of view into the ether and get potentially hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people supporting you is entirely there, and that didn't exist before. So what happens in the political world is that's driving people to say things that otherwise wouldn't have been said, and getting people against that. So it enables and emboldens people because now it's out there, so you can say it. So that's just a reality of our time, and I don't think we can legislate away technology. So we're going to need to figure that out. I don't have an answer. It is certainly true what you're saying that, and I don't want to just put it on any one political leader. I mean, you and I might share a point of view on a particular leader, but that's not my purpose. I think that is a function of the changing nature and the ability to win in our system by keep making people more outraged on this end and more outraged on this end so that you capture more supporters. That's actually a function of what's going on in politics right now. I do have some level of confidence that my 23-year-old and my 26-year-old and my 27 and 28-year-old, they're going to understand social media a lot more than I am. And when I got people screaming at me in social media, I took it personally. They don't. They're like, well, whatever, Dad. That's not whatever. It's just social media. So it may be different in the next generation, and we may get to a different place. But I would acknowledge that it's a rocky time for polite discourse right now.
We have a question here, but just loud enough so they can hear you at the back.
Okay, what are your thoughts, and if you were Prime Minister, since you've been invited to apply, what would you be doing about the Trump's 25% tariffs? And in that regard, I'm wondering if you had a chance to read Chrétien's editorial, if you agree with what he said, or what should we be doing? Because it's scaring a lot of people, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of direction at the top.
So, first of all, I mean, in my estimation, and everyone will have a different opinion because lots of you around this room have lived as long or longer than me, Jean Chrétien was, the most successful prime minister in my time. I think that he was someone who dealt with issues and challenges in a way that was responsible and, made progress on some important issues. Every prime minister faces challenges. Nobody is perfect. But I thought he comported himself well, and I thought he's an ethical and straightforward guy. And I like him personally. So all those good things. But he's not in this mix. He's not worked with Trump. I will tell you that I was the one who negotiated the last tariff. So during Trump #1, they put 25% tariff on steel and 10% on aluminum, and it fell to me to negotiate those tariffs and to get rid of them. So what we did last time was we decided that we were going to put retaliatory tariffs on things that were going to cause particular concern for Donald Trump. I think it was absolutely the right strategy at that time, because at that time, you got to think back, he was going into a re-election. So he was concerned about getting re-elected. We put tariffs on things that were in places where he needed the votes. So we were specifically creating pain points for him. Now, my wife Nancy, who's in the front row here, will remember a night where we were in Europe with our family on vacation, where I must have gotten 25 phone calls as we put those reciprocal tariffs into place from the Secretary of the Treasury, calling me saying, don't do this, he's going to kill you. And I'd say, well, we're going to do it. He'd go back down to the Oval Office, and he'd get screamed at, and he'd come back, and he'd call me. And I'm sitting having dinner at 11 o'clock at night because of the time zone, taking these calls and saying, look, we're doing it. And he'd go back down and tell Trump, and the phone calls just went on forever. Point being, they really worked to piss him off. But that's the moral of the story. If we want to really piss them off, we can put retaliatory tariffs on. So I ask you whether that is our objective. For me, that is not our objective. Trump is not going into a re-election campaign. He's there. It's at the beginning of his term. They are not talking about tariffs on steel and aluminum. They're talking about tariffs across our whole economy. That is a very different beast. It took us 12 months to get rid of the steel and aluminum tariffs last time. 12 months of economy-wide tariffs is not something we want to see in this country. So I am not at all convinced that retaliatory tariffs are a good idea. I think you need to look through and ask yourself, what is it that they want? What is it that they want? Because they don't want to have 25% higher costs on gas and oil in the United States. What they want, I think, is three things. I think they want to make sure their border is secure. Absolutely want to make sure their border is secure for lots of good reasons. And we want to make sure our border is secure too. If they start kicking people out of their country, they're going to start coming north. And we don't want to have uncontrolled immigration. So we should have an orderly process for immigration. So that's a shared interest. Number two, they want us to spend more on defense. We spend 1.37%. The goal at NATO is 2%. We're a laggard. People in this room will have different points of view, but all I can say is that if we're going to be a strong ally, it's very hard to say that we're going to rely on someone else to take responsibility for our defense in a time where the world is getting more dangerous. So that's expensive, but I'm pretty sure it's what they want, and pretty well everyone else is ponied up. Third thing I know they want is they want more investments in the United States, just like we want more investments in Canada. Well, the second thing, more spending on defense, would equal more investments in the United States, because who do you think makes a lot of the kit that you need for defense? So I think there is a way to think about what they want and what we want and get to a solution. So I just don't know that the interim step of trying to beat them over the head when we're David and they're Goliath is necessarily the right approach. And I think it will likely extend the period of negotiation. I'll tell you, in that negotiation that I was in with steel and aluminum tariffs, me and Stephen Mnuchin, who was the Treasury Secretary at that time, it took us about 10 minutes to agree that these things didn't make sense, that we had a fairly balanced trade situation, that we had a few things that we needed to do, like we needed to protect against what's called transshipments that were coming from other countries through us to the United States. There were things we had to do. We figured them out pretty fast. Still took us 12 months to get over it. So I think you'd be careful with your quick responses, and think with your head, not with your heart. So the fact that he's making us mad, come on. I mean, it's okay. I mean, we'll get over it. I mean, it's a little bit silly, and we can move on, and we should be a stalwart ally to the United States. It's, as a function of geography, it's always going to be our number one trading partner, and many of our families are going to live there, and there's every reason for us to be the grown-up in the room. That's my view.
Question from students. So sorry, we'll go here. So and that might be it for questions. Okay.
I wanted to ask, with if you believe polls, how bad they're looking for the Liberals, and with the crisis brewing south of the storm, and how little the government would be in place before an election, why would anyone want to be the head of the Liberal Party right now?
So that comes back to Alex's question with me. You know, why would someone want to do that right now? Well, I think I do recognize that polls are not always right, but they're almost always directionally right. So the nature of the polls right now tell us that it will be an extremely steep climb for the Liberals in the next election, and it's improbable at best that they will get anywhere near a minority government, let alone anything bigger than that. It's highly unlikely. So that I'm not telling you anything you don't know. So why would you do it? Well, you might believe that it's 80% likely that the Conservatives are going to win. I might believe it's 95% likely the Conservatives are going to win. So in either of those scenarios, there's either a 1 out of 5 or a 1 out of 20 chance that an alternative outcome will happen. So you might win. I mean, it's possible. I think it's improbable, but it's possible. But more importantly, if you believe in the strength of a parliamentary democracy and the need for an official opposition that brings other ideas into the mix, then you see it as a part of the responsibility to be leading that party that's bringing other ideas that will change the dynamic, and they will help people to think about what alternative strategies might exist to attack things. And it may well be that actually moderates the policies that come out. So there's a real role for the official opposition. And then there's a responsibility for someone to recover from a shellacking in the polls. So if what happens is what I expect and the Liberals lose badly, then someone will need to rebuild. And so that's important. And it might be 4 years from now, or it might be 8 years from now, but there'll be another opportunity to go into government. It may be the person who wins this time around, or that person may not be the next person. They may be the person that combats this election, and they may step down, and there may be another opportunity. So, these are really important roles. The leader of the opposition is a really important role. I would just tell you personally, the idea of being in the opposition for 4 years, I might poke my eyes out before I took that job. But others see it as something they want to do. So there you go.
That's great. So this is what I would like to do. So you have to get to the airport. I know you're already pushing, but you have some book prizes.